Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this legislative press conference. I'm Bailey Carlson, Director of Constituent Services for the Governor's Office. Just a reminder to those on the phones, if you would please state your name and which news source you work for. Also, that you can mute your lines by pressing *6 and unmute during the Q&A by pressing the # and then 6. Also, for those in the room, please turn on your mics at the table when you have a question and make sure you're speaking into them. Now I'll turn it over to Governor Daugaard.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the conference. Today I thought I'd lead off by just commenting. I signed a little over 20 bills this morning. Included among them some that I think are noteworthy is the omnibus water bill that spends about $13 million on water projects that will be funded across the state. These would be drinking water, wastewater projects, solid waste projects, all related to water and the environment. And these are funds that are set aside by the fee collected on petroleum tank inspections and lotto. And every year we sign a multi-million-dollar bill like this that helps fund the maintenance of primarily municipal projects. I also signed a bill this morning related to drug use. We have, of course, controlled substances laws, and every year the inventive chemists among us find means to modify a prohibited substance in some way and then can make the claim that this is a different substance, it's not prohibited, and so we can freely sell and distribute it. And so, for example, fentanyl is a growing problem in South Dakota. Meth users will sometimes turn to fentanyl, or you'll have mixture of fentanyl with other drugs, and then there's some fentanyl lookalikes that this bill will prohibit, and I think it tries to categorically prohibit fentanyl lookalikes. So I signed that this morning. And then finally, and you should have press releases about that in your inbox. Then finally, something that I signed this morning was a bill that amended some legislation that passed last year that allowed the Board of Regents to take some action with the School for the Deaf property in Sioux Falls, which is in some areas improved but not fully occupied, and in other areas unimproved land that is idle and for which there's no foreseeable use. And at my encouragement, the legislature passed a bill last year to authorize the Board of Regents to sell this property. And they came back and asked, could we have a little bit more flexibility to sell or lease some of the improved property? And then also we learned between last year and this year that some of the property is original trust property that's constitutionally protected in terms of where the money goes. Some of the property is not original trust property, and so there's a little more flexibility about how those dollars may be spent. In both cases, they will ultimately benefit the School for the Deaf. It's just whether they must go into a trust fund or whether they could be spent on capital improvements for the School for the Deaf or in some other way benefit the School for the Deaf. So that bill was signed this morning, and that gives the Board of Regents the ability to move forward and have more flexibility to lease or sublease the improved property and to sell or otherwise deal with the unimproved property. One other topic that I thought might be of interest, if you didn't see it, earlier this week we released revenue receipts for the taxes we collected at the very end of January. In most cases, in many cases I should say, these are taxes that were collected by Department of Revenue directly in January. In some cases, they reflect, for example, in sales taxes, they reflect taxes collected by retailers in December. And then then sent to revenue in January. So they're a month older than some of the other taxes, if you will, and that's always been the case. So the news on that front is positive. The revenue received was a little better than we had hoped, and this is the second month in a row where we see revenue is a little bit better than the situation I was faced when I presented the budget in December. So, in other words, sequentially, I presented the budget. Now we've since had 2 more months of better revenue. And so this gives us a picture that is a little brighter. It may be that we'll get closer to our FY18 target that we'd originally identified when the legislature adjourned last year. Time will tell. The thing to watch, if you're in the media, is Monday, the Joint Appropriations Committee will be hearing now the projection forward. Given these additional months of history, the Bureau of Finance and Management will adopt a new revenue projection, and the Legislative Research Council economists will also adopt a new revenue projection, and both of those projections will be presented to the Joint Appropriations Committee on Monday. And then I believe they intend to formally choose a number, whether it's one or the other or something in between or whatever it may be, choose a number in a formal way Tuesday. And of course that will then govern how much expenditures we must live within. So that's coming up, and it's positive news to some degree. And so we'll hope for a good revenue projection. The admonition I will always be giving to the legislature is, let's be careful and not be too rosy in our projection. We want to, we can always spend the money after it arrives. If we project something that doesn't show up, then we end up having to cut the budget, and that's a bait and switch from the vantage point of someone who's expecting payments and then is surprised when they are suddenly cut. We haven't seen it to a great degree in this state, but many states see that pretty regularly. And so I think we want to continue a pattern where we project revenue conservatively and live within that conservative estimate. And if good news arrives and more money is there, then there's still time to spend it at that point. With that, I'll open up for questions.
Have you spoken with Mr. Chaloger about what kind of projection he might be bringing to appropriation?
The question was, have I spoken to Jim Terwilliger, our Bureau of Finance and Management economist, about what his projection will be? And the answer is no, I haven't. I know he's working on the calculations. As I say, we just got the most recent month this year, or excuse me, this week. The other thing to recall is that when we put together the projection in December, the Council of Economic Advisors, as well as our national level economy firm, Markit, M-A-R-K-I-T, both were making their projections of leading indicators based upon an assumption that no tax bill would pass. Of course, subsequently, a tax bill did pass, and so Jim is also consulting with our economists about how that has changed their outlook for the national economy, which of course impacts the South Dakota economy as well. And that will be a factor as well as this historical receipts situation.
Just building off that question, can you say, are you more optimistic that state employees, education, Medicaid providers might get an increase this year based on these numbers?
There's certainly hope for that now, where I would say in December there was little hope for that. But time will tell. We'll see. We'll see what the economists. I must say the Bureau of Finance and Management has a very good algorithm. They don't always hit the mark with their projection, but they're always very close, unless there's some very significant recession that comes upon us. Otherwise, they're pretty close, within 0.5% or 1%. That's pretty good when you're dealing with a $1.6 billion budget. Still, that 1%, if it's 1.6 billion, that could be $16 million, right? So that's a big number. So you don't want to be off, and if you're going to be off, you need to be off by conservative estimates of revenue that revenue actually exceeds, rather than off on the other side.
And just looking at the year-to-date, it looks like it's 18.2 million above your December budget projection. I mean, can you characterize in your mind how significant you think that variance is? It seems like a lot.
It's certainly good. We've also had some months leading up to the projection where we were down quite a bit. You know, we've had months, I'll just give you an example. Last year, if you hearken back to last year, we had pretty good revenue up until the last revenue month before, I think it was last month before we adjourned, where revenue was down 10 million as compared to what our projection was. So in 1 month, you could have a pretty wide swing. And then we had 3 months of relatively good revenue, and then we had a string of bad months of bad revenue. So it can be all over the board.
There's also Senate Bill 177, which would, I think, tie state employees' wage increases to the CPI. Have you looked at that bill? Is that something you support?
I think we have to always live within our revenue. I think it would be nice to say we should automatically make payments based on inflation, but if our revenue doesn't meet inflationary targets, then that law is just a statement of attitude. We just can't execute a law like that. So I think we've, in the years I've been in office, of course, the first year we had to make significant cuts, and we were not able to give salary increases to state employees. In several years after that, we gave increases that were in excess of inflation to try and catch up. And then last year, and again this year, at least to date, I should say last year, in the current year, fiscal year 18, the budget does not allow for salary increases, and my December FY19 budget did not propose any salary increases. Now, as I just responded to your question, I'm hopeful that we can do better than zero for FY19 if the revenue projections allow it.
Changing the topic a bit, two Senate committees took up your bill, Senate Bill 169, as well as another proposal, Senate Bill 173, which doesn't allow for the same amount of self-distribution by craft brewers. Is that something you're willing to budge on, or will you compromise on self-distribution?
Well, at this stage, I still think our bill is very defensible and is the right policy. Again, the alcohol controls that are a creature of state law has treated the alcohol industry differently than any other industry, where we establish how the alcohol is manufactured and distributed and retailed. And we don't do that with other industries. If you're manufacturing farm equipment, we don't say you must deal through a distributor. If you're producing donuts, we don't say you have to deal through a distributor. I can't think of any other law in South Dakota where we say if you're a manufacturer of some kind of product, you can only deal through a distributor. And so it was that way in the beginning, I think, after Prohibition, when there really was quite a bit of public sentiment that was divided and very passionate about whether alcohol should be permitted or not permitted. And when Prohibition ended, those who gained permission in law, I think, may have gained that permission only because that permission was very highly regulated. And the way alcohol made its way into consumers' hands was very highly controlled. Now, is there justification for doing that? Some sort of a public safety, or I could see the argument that it makes it easier to tax it because it's much more centralized. But I believe our Department of Revenue is satisfied they can continue to control that and collect taxes fairly. And so, again, I think conceptually, the regulation makes no sense to me. The tightly regulated process of dealing only through distributors. It should be up to the free market to decide whether distributor use makes sense, as it does in many products, or whether direct retailing should be allowed, as it is in many products.
Can you give us any sense of how negotiations are going, or what have you been doing to try and pass your bill versus Senator Byrd's bill? What's going to happen there?
Well, I think both bills have passed out of committee, and they're on the floor, and ultimately the Senate will have to take them up. And I think there's been a delay to make sure all parties who are involved in the discussion have an opportunity to hear from both sides. And so I'm sure the senators are hearing from both sides, probably ad nauseum. And but ultimately they're going to have to make a judgment. Is the one bill a better policy than the other? They'll have to make that judgment.
On that same issue, there are two sitting legislators who have a pretty active stake in that discussion. Both are distributors. Do you think they should be able to vote on that policy change?
I do. I think we have legislators from every walk of life, and to the extent that the legislators have a stake in some topic, they might also have unique and valuable information on that topic as well. So if there's a bill about governors and the governor is in the legislature, then that governor can speak about the nature of being a governor, and everyone will know, well, that guy's a governor, so we have to take what he says with a grain of salt. So it doesn't matter what occupation you are. Anytime a piece of legislation comes up that bears upon your occupation, I think the important thing is everyone knows, in this case, that the legislators who have a stake have that stake. And they also appreciate the additional information and insights they can bring. And in this case, I don't have any doubt that these two individuals are honest people. In my opinion, they're honest people.
The Senate Ag Committee debated Senate Bill 199 last night, fairly late, and just wanted to get your sense on the legislation and maybe some discussion on that discussion on building water company.
Yes. In this situation, instead of having, as in the alcohol bills, both bills in the same house, we've got one bill in the Senate and one bill in the House. Or I should say one bill has already made it through the House, gone through the whole process, and the other bill is still making its way through the Senate. And again, I have a great deal of respect for the sponsors of the Senate bill as individuals, and our administration is especially interested in certainty. We have certainty today, and if the legislature finds some other means of balancing the interests of landowners and the interests of sportsmen in a way that is agreeable to a majority of the two bodies, then it probably is worthy of signature. Now, whether they can find that in this proposed alternative to the current law, I don't know. From the attitude of the committee, when they sent it down without recommendation, it seems that the committee doesn't think so, doesn't think it's there, but they wanted to give the whole body a chance to debate this issue and have it open to the full floor and have public debate in that forum. So I respect that, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to handle it, and we'll see how that debate plays out. The Senate's already made their judgment, at least on the bill I had proposed, and that's status quo. Although I saw they repealed the sunset date entirely. So right now, it wouldn't have a sunset date 3 years from now, as I had proposed, and I think was originally part of the summer study bill. It just simply has no sunset whatsoever.
Do you agree with repealing that sunset and just making it permanent?
Well, I think either one is fine. In any case, I think the original idea was to give a several-year period before the legislature would be forced to look at it again. After several years, I think we would have a good sense of whether there's some problems. Still, though, if you think about it, if we have a sense that there's some problems, we'd probably act anyway to address those problems. Someone who is concerned about it would raise it in the legislature anyway, whether the sunset date had arrived or whether it's a year ahead of that. So I think either way it can work all right.
Turn to the phones, if there's any questions on the phones. Remember to do the pound sign and 6 to unmute yourself. All right, back to the room.
We're about halfway through session right now, closing in on that. Could you give us an overview of how you look at the past several weeks and what we're looking at in the weeks to come other than long days and nights?
Yes. Well, first of all, as you know, we have a pretty heavy bill load this year. I think this is the heaviest bill load I've had as governor in my 8th session now. Some of that is impacted by mirror bills, which is a creature, I would say, of the last decade. And some of it is a creature of placeholder bills or title bills, where something not much more than a title is introduced. And again, that's something 20 years ago that was not done. So that impacts the bill load. And to the extent that the same exact issue is raised by identical bills in the two houses, I think the debate certainly is not twice as long as it would be if you had two completely different issues. That being said, I do give credit to the legislature. I know in some weeks they have completed their entire calendar before leaving for the week. And in prior years, sometimes you never saw that. Now today, I know they're not planning to do that because of the weather, but I would not have been surprised if they stayed to complete their entire debate calendar before going home, were it not for the bad weather we're seeing. So I give credit for the legislature, and then they're foreseeing this bill load as, not foreseeing, reacting to the bill load. Several committees have immediately turned to additional meetings in the afternoons and evenings, and again, that's a very responsible approach to managing it well before we near the end of session. Certainly they're attentive to crossover day, which is coming up as well, but they're handling things responsibly. I think that's good legislative leadership.
In the next 3 weeks ahead, what do you forecast? What do you see as being?
Well, I think things will be very busy again next week as people are confronted with the impending crossover day. And then I think the last week, and they'll also be dealing with revenue, and to the extent there's a better projection of revenue, then there will be debates about how to deal with that revenue and who should benefit. And but I do think probably the last week of session will be, as it always is, a little bit slower. You know, there might be some conference committees that deal with one or two issues that are still in dispute. Last year we had a lot of conference committees that were very active near the end, but I don't know that we'll see that again. We might, but it's this week or two preceding crossover day is always very busy. So this week we're seeing that. Next week I think we'll see it too.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask about the revenue again.
Yes.
Do you have any priority for if there were to be an increase in education and state workers specifically?
Well, in recent years, those three, education, Medicaid providers, and state employees, have been treated about the same. In the year 2 years ago, of course, we gave a very substantial increase to education, and I think that, you know, the legislature is conscious of that. And this year, in spite of the poor revenue forecast, we still hope to free up some dollars in Medicaid through use of this policy about Indian Health Service users, and then the dollars that are freed up from those savings, I proposed that we turn around and spend on Medicaid services and provider rates. So my hope is that the legislature will give attention to state employees. We know from a pretty comprehensive salary survey that we are behind the market. And as I mentioned in the budget speech, we have some groups of employees that are considerably behind the market. And so if they want to depart from this pattern where we've given the same percentage to all, I hope they give some nod to state employees, because I think unless we do that, we're going to have more turnover and we'll have difficulty recruiting, and so I'm hopeful they'll give some attention to employees.
Do you worry at all about the state losing its competitive edge that allows you to keep some of those employees?
I do. I think most of our state employees are very hardworking and dedicated and feel good about public service. I think that's part of their motivation for working for the state versus a private employer. But at some point, you still need to be able to pay a working wage, a living wage, and it's hard to say to a state employee, stay with us even though you're being offered more money to do something very similar, even in your own community. So, you know, whether it be correctional employees that are attracted to jails in nearby town or in the same town, or law enforcement officers that are attracted to sheriffs or police departments or other things like that, we have to be competitive, or people can still give public service and feel that sense of giving back to their community, but working for a different government level, and so we have to be competitive.
I was just going to ask, I know Dana asked generally about this last week, but it's Representative Nicholson's bill on petition circulators, and it would be requiring a lot more information for circulators, the prefix of their cell phone number, you know, where they went to, how much they're paying tuition, that kind of thing. Can you say specifically what you think of that bill?
Yes, I since last week have seen that bill and read it, and I must say the list is quite a laundry list. And I wonder, I think the intent is good. I think we do want circulators who are South Dakota residents to be honestly South Dakota residents. I have heard a circulator say, myself, that they were from Colorado. And yet they thought because they worked for a company that was based in South Dakota, they were told they were okay to circulate. Well, that's not right. That's not what the law says. So we might have to be a little bit more overt through some sort of an affidavit where people understand, I personally must be a resident. I can't work for a South Dakota organization. I must personally be a resident. And so whether the affidavit has to contain the level of detail that this bill does or not, in some way we have to help, in most cases, I'm sure, innocent mistakes, we have to prevent them. And in some cases where people are intentionally violating the law, we have to, through an affidavit or some other means, make them conscious that now you're committing a crime and you're doing so in writing, and you might be held to account. So I'm not sure. I think a middle ground would be found or can be found. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Hey, safe travels if you're on the road. Oh, I'm sorry, there is a question.
Governor, real quick, I've got two, and that was based on what some of the legislative leaders were talking about at their press conferences this morning. One would be your thoughts on a bill that would make texting and driving a primary offense, and the second, there's another one floating around regarding the lengths of the terms that lawmakers would serve. Should lawmakers spend more time out here legislating before having to worry about running for re-election?
Oh, I see. Well, on the former, if that texting bill reaches my desk, I'd sign that. I think texting and driving is extremely dangerous. And there's many other distractions, of course, that you could point to and say, well, why do we allow eating and driving, and why do we allow listening to the radio or doing other things that many people do? I'd say relatively more safely, albeit a distraction, but texting and driving is extremely dangerous because you're incented or not incented. Your inclination is to keep reading instead of glancing at the radio dial or glancing at the fuel gauge or glancing in the rearview mirror and then back to the road. When you glance at a text, you're inclined to keep reading, and so that's very dangerous. And so I could see signing that bill if it gets through the legislature. As for term limits, whether a legislator serves 2 or 4 years, I think is of less consequence than how long a legislator serves. In my estimation, 8-year term limits is a little too short. I like term limits. I think term limits are good, but 8 years is a little too short to force people to either run for the other house. If it were up to me and I was writing a brand new law, I'd say 12 years total and out, period. And I would say it doesn't matter if you switch houses or stay, a total of 12 years and out. That would be my attitude. You'd have enough institutional knowledge. You'd have people that would stay in their house and develop some relationships with their members, and those who deserve to be leaders would emerge to be leaders, and there wouldn't be this jockeying for leadership as you see with shorter term limits. So that would be my attitude, but there's no such bill proposed for that right now. More than you want to know, probably.
Would you run for a third term?
As governor? No. You have to remember, I'm not just 8 years as governor, but 8 years as lieutenant governor, and 6 years as senator, and I think people need fresh blood, and I've had a good shot at influencing policy in one way or another in different ways, and I feel good about the successes. I don't always have success, but I've had a number of successes, and I feel good about those. And now it's time for people with new ideas and better ideas to come and make us even better. All right, thanks, everyone.